speak sounding kind of radical and like galvanizing, but push centrist policies. And he is very good at when he needs to. He can sound woke or not racist, whatever, and anti-racist, but he usually is voting for racist policies.
No one ever said it was easy to get to become the leader of the free world.
They are the vanquished, vanquished, vanquished.
Welcome to the Vanquished. Anders J. Lee here with Freddie G.
So happy to be here.
And we are talking today, in the year of our Lord 2025, about a previous president of the United States, a man who was the president, Joe Biden, who is in the news and is the subject of a book that's coming out that we are eagerly awaiting. Can't wait to get my hands on that galley or the PDF that hopefully is going to be sent to us by the publisher of the Jake Tapper book about all of the hilarious lengths the White House and the Biden world went to hide his very obvious condition from the public, and kind of what they told themselves to sort of justify it. But of course, that's a scandal that I mean, it still comes up occasionally because I forgot this when he left office. There is actually a post-presidency for Joe Biden. He doesn't just die after becoming president, or he didn't die. He has been trotted out to a couple events. There was one where he dropped an ice cream sandwich. I think he was giving a speech to Harvard.
He's just clumsy. Yeah, that's not old age. That's just clumsy. That could happen to anybody.
That's true. But then he also confused Ukraine with Iraq, I think, at the same event. He wants to get more in the mix for the Democrats. He and Jill, they want to step out and campaign for Democratic candidates throughout the country. And the party, of course, wants nothing to do with them because they are arguably the reason that Trump is president right now, because they just demanded that Joe stay in. But to kind of understand what happened there in 2024 and earlier, you kind of have to understand Joe Biden, and you have to understand other points at which he's lost, namely the 1988, which was his first presidential campaign. It was a losing campaign, and it's kind of a footnote for some scandals that we'll talk about, but it is sort of illustrative of his broader career. The guy has foot and mouth disease. He's got a lot of problems, a big ego, really, that comes through in this, and I think maybe taught him some lessons for the future, but the wrong lessons. As we'll get into.
Yeah, he's 44, so he's too young to be president. He was also a guy who he never really ran when he was the right age. He was always either like too old or too young. I guess in 08, which is his middle campaign, he's 64, so maybe he's at the sweet spot then. In this stage, he's pre-Genocide Joe. He's young. He has brown hair, not too much of it. He seems very smarmy to me. That's the thing is, yeah, his warmth, I think he grew over time. He really doesn't seem very warm in this period.
Yeah, he's very aggressive, very feisty with the press. He's like angry at the media, which is a theme that comes up later, of course. But to understand this campaign, you kind of have to understand the Democratic Party at this time. Joe was elected in 1972 during the McGovern-Nixon campaign, and was a part of a new crop of Democrats who were against the war. They hated Nixon, but they kept the traditional New Deal coalition a bit at arm's length. And Biden is an example of somebody who really benefited from New Deal programs, but basically dug the grave for a lot of those same programs and kind of that social structure that benefited him and so many other people of his generation that they kind of turned their backs on in the 70s and 80s. He was a New Democrat. He defeated a Republican, ran a very anti-corruption campaign. Of course, he was elected when he was 29, and I think had to wait to be sworn in. And then his family members of it passed away in a car crash. And there's a great book that I got some of this from, Yesterday's Man by Branko Marcetic, which came out in 2019. And at the time, I remember some of the reaction was like, well, why are you writing this book about Joe Biden? He was the vice president. He's going to run for president, but it's like he may not be relevant. 2019, there were a few months there where it looked like he was out. He was not going to get the nomination. So it would have been great for this to be an irrelevant book, but sadly, it turned out to be very relevant, at least over the past 4 or 5 years.
I picture Obama seeing the book, and like, I'll show you, he's tomorrow's man, and then rigging the primary against Bernie.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, anybody who the left does not like Obama will try to support in some way. But as a senator, Biden moved with the party to the center. He supported a lot of sort of the Reaganite austerity policies. But I was going to say his family, they died in this car crash. His wife and his daughter and his sons were injured in it. They have trauma. This is a part of Hunter's issues with addiction come from the trauma of this car accident. He blamed a drunk driver for the accident for years. I think to this day, Joe Biden might still attribute that crash to a drunk driver. The guy who was in the other car maintains that he was not drunk. So Joe Biden is like, this was a drunk guy, and this poor guy who I don't know enough to comment on whose was fully at fault. You know, it's a very sad thing, but sometimes people who perish from car accidents aren't looking. This is why you shouldn't, text and drive and stuff like that. It's possible that Nelia Biden may have been looking the wrong way or something, and that's why it happened. I don't fully know, but he blamed this guy for years, and that kind of shows you something about Biden's personality, and this also comes up later. In that book, he does a citizen's arrest on a guy who's speeding. He like chases after him during a birthday party, or he sees this guy speeding by a birthday party and goes out and citizens arrest him. And he's like, I'm a U.S. senator. You are speeding. This is despicable. You must cease. You must go to jail. Mind you, Joe Biden brags about muscle cars. He has that ad where he was like, boy, could my dad drive a car? That little campaign video they did in 2020 where he's like washing off a Mustang or something like that. I guess he's driving these hotshot cars at like 20 miles an hour or something.
Oh, that's funny. Biden wanted to have his shirt. I don't remember that ad, but he wanted to have his shirt off in that ad. I was trying to find the Richard Ben Kramer and What It Takes does talk about the accident. I thought he said it was a truck, but it's something where she was at a stop sign and then she goes ahead and the car just comes out of nowhere and hits her.
Okay.
Yeah. Kramer does not report, and he's writing this book about 20 years after the crash. He does not report that the guy's drunk. Yeah. I mean, Kramer would probably feel cruel making it seem like it was Nelia's fault. I'm not sure. But just I think she looks both ways at the stop sign, and maybe the other guy just was speeding, or who knows. But yeah, I do like, because I really want to bash Jill, but yeah, bashing Nelia, we're going hard. So yeah. Anybody is bashable to me. So
right. Even Hunter, at the end of the day, he did kind of co-sign all his dad's bad stuff, even if he's admirable in other ways. But going into the 1980s, Biden has supported Jimmy Carter. He supported him in 76, and then in 1980, he was like, "This Jimmy Carter is not the best guy, not the best thing since wheat cakes, but he'll get the job done." Very like unenthusiastic sort of support for Carter's reelection. And then by the mid 80s, he's seen as kind of, even though he's just supported Jimmy Carter as his failed president, he's seen as the new face of the Democratic Party. Like this is the type of guy we need to run. And in 1983, when Mondale is gearing up to run for president, there's an attempt to put forward Joe Biden as an alternative. That was a real possibility, but he does not decide to run.
How so? Yeah. So there's Gary Hart as well. I think Gary Hart's a bit more of an outsider. Biden is young, but has been in the Senate for 15 years, so he's not an outsider. How would you compare Gary Hart and Biden? Because those are the two like up and coming guys, and then Mondale's whatever. He's older, I think, and Dukakis is not insanely old, but he's just very boring. And he kind of ends up winning almost by default. But how would you compare Gary Hart and Biden, who both end up dropping out for different reasons in this race?
Yeah, well, Gary Hart also does run in 1984.
Oh, sure.
But he
finishes second in that one.
Right. And the strategist, Pat Cadell, who's trying to get Biden to run, winds up working for Gary Hart and kind of does the strategy he has pre-selected for Joe Biden onto Gary Hart to be like kind of the anti-special interest, quote unquote, candidate. And it doesn't quite work, but there's tapping into a real phenomenon in the Democratic Party and in America. Yuppies, young, upwardly mobile professionals, people like Joe Biden, for instance, and Gary Hart. The key difference between Hart and Biden, I would say, is that Hart is an intellectual. He's very well. I'm serious. He's like very keen on policies. Very detailed policy proposals, very serious about foreign policy, has a vision of America's role in the world. And Biden isn't really so much of a wonk. He has wonkish tendencies, like he knows about policies and stuff, but he really downplays when he does run for president in 88, 87, he really downplays policy issues, and he's like, I'm running something a little more from the heart, no pun intended. But he's trying to, be a down to earth kind of an affable guy, and isn't worried so much about the high minded stuff. I'd say is the main difference. So,
and his heart is what gets him in trouble too, because he cheats on his wife.
That's
so
right.
I looked up Gary Hart just now. I don't think he's that good looking, but compared to Joe Biden and maybe the rest of the field, he's the sexy candidate. And Joe Biden has just this horrible comb over. Joe Biden's comb over is really bad in this point because he has different levels of hair depending on the day. So it's just how good of a comb over he did. I don't even know. Like, it's not a piece. It's a Biden original. But yeah, Gary Hart is a lot sexier than that. Go ahead.
Right. It's rough. But pre-balding Joe Biden, pre-comb over, he is a pretty good looking guy. If you look back to those photos from his 72 race, and then when he's a young man, he had a nice face and a nice head of hair before it started going away. And that, politics is very aesthetic. It's possible that played a role because it is an obvious comb over. And then in the 90s, he straight up gets hair plugs. And we've commented on this before, but like, it's just so crazy to be known by the public as visibly balding.
Yeah.
And then one day you'd show up and you have hair. Like, are people not supposed to notice that? It's just such a crazy, it's like, the George Costanza showing up to work after you've been fired type of thing, or after you quit. Like, people are going to remember that you didn't have hair and notice that now you do. But this is part of Joe Biden's sort of weird, specific type of narcissism, I guess, where it's a kind of a dishonesty. It's an insecurity, almost. And that actually explains a lot about him and a lot about, what did him in 1988.
So yeah, Costanza also has an episode where he has a wig. So there's that comparison too. He goes crazy thick and it looks bad, and then he's loving it, but Elaine rips the wig off. So there's that. I did look up young Joe Biden. He looks kind of like Eli Manning, but a little bit hotter. So Eli Manning is secret hot. He's one of those, like, there's women where like Tina Fey in 2001, every dude thought she was hot and that no other dude knew it. And that's how Eli Manning is. Every woman thinks Eli Manning's hot. Please correct me, ladies, if I'm wrong. And but doesn't know other guys do it. So yeah, he had that quality, Joe Biden.
Interesting. Yeah, you definitely see the Manning resemblance. But in the mid 80s, Biden was very active on the party speaking circuit. He was often compared to his colleague Ted Kennedy. And what turned out 1988, as well as 1984, but Kennedy wasn't going to run again. He had one shot we talked about in that episode, but he doesn't run in 88, and that kind of helps Biden out. And 1986, he gets some attention from a Senate hearing where he really passionately and righteously goes after South African apartheid. And it's, for its day, kind of a viral moment, or like a stab at a viral moment, because he's really letting them have it. And there, of course, the Reagan guy is offended that he would be questioned in such a way. But he is an effective speaker and a very natural speaker. And this comes through in Richard Ben Kramer's writing about Joe Biden, that he's one of the subjects of What It Takes, which we've talked about on the show. Massive profile of the key candidates in the 1988 race, of which Joe Biden was one. In 1987, when things were shaping up, it seemed like he was going to be a front runner potentially. But he had a stutter as a kid, and Richard Ben Kramer writes that he kind of makes up for it by just talking all the time, and talking a lot and very quickly. He's a fast talker, and he says a lot of stuff that he shouldn't, and maybe that comes from growing up with a stutter. Once it goes away, then it's like this newfound freedom to gab. And he loves talking about deals. There's deals that he's made on his house, which is a very big thing with 80s Joe Biden. He has a mansion outside Wilmington. It's got a ballroom. It's a really huge place. Richard Ben Kramer describes it as the type of place old Italian guys died building, which is a nice line.
So they have a debate, and he airs a video where he's from that mansion, and yes,
Yeah.
it looks just like that. It is. So he's playing up the mansion. He's proud of it. He has a lot of Trump in him. Yeah, he's into real estate deals. Yeah, talking fast, making real estate deals.
Yeah.
Yeah, lot of similarities.
And similar to Trump, too, he doesn't want to pay a guy to clear asbestos out of his mansion, or he thinks the guy's charging too much. So he does it himself as a U.S. senator. That may have induced some further brain damage. Honestly, maybe has some explanation for what he's been like the past 5 or 6 years. But this is a kind of a strange moment from What It Takes. He sits down with Richard Ben Kramer, and this begins on a drive. They're driving, and Biden says, well, if I do run for president, because he's thinking about it at this point, if I do run, then they're going to go after me. The press is going to tear through everything about me, all the dirt, and then he just starts reciting all of the dirt. Ben Kramer calls it confession and apologia. It goes on for hours. They wind up in his kitchen, I guess, and it's 1 a.m. and Biden is talking about all the debts he's incurred. He's talking about his the women he's dated between his marriages. He has a list with commentary about each partner, and how he was during those trysts. He says that this is a hard time for him when he's dating. He talks about Jill, his wife's first marriage to not the greatest guy in the world, which I believe she was still married to when she started volunteering for Joe Biden, and then became a little more than volunteering, if I'm not mistaken. And then by 2 a.m, they're talking about getting down with Jill Biden, what it's like to make love to his wife, which is another thing he talks a lot about. Even before this, during his first marriage, he would brag on the campaign trail about going home to make love to his wife.
That is the thing with presidents. A lot of them do not still fuck their wives, okay? But Joe Biden did. Obama had that too. Bill Clinton didn't. Trump, no way. You know, there's a lot of not. Yeah, Richard Nixon, who knows when the last time he had sex.
Yeah.
But yeah, Joe Biden fucked Jill. It seems like she probably has permission. If he goes senile, she's still allowed to fuck him. I would think. Like, I think that's okay. Yeah, I think he's gonna pre-consent. I think he'll be fucking her to his last day.
Yeah. Ugh, can't imagine. But
yeah, I went a little too far.
well, it's true. It is unfortunately true. And he also talks about the University of Delaware, where he went and was screwed. He says he screwed around and got probation for dousing the dorm director with a fire extinguisher. These are all things he's telling to a reporter who's writing a book. And he just goes on about streaking through a parking lot and lying to priests and then telling them the truth and having to do Hail Marys. And
he'd be a terrible poker player.
Yeah, true. Yeah, maybe that's why he has so much debt at this point. Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry, he doesn't end up having a good net worth until he leaves like the vice presidency and gets a bunch of speaking gigs. One of the Wikipedia was saying. So he had never in this point is he coming out ahead.
Right. So this mansion is paid for with his senator's salary, and that's probably that's why he didn't pay an asbestos guys because couldn't afford it. All his money went into this freaking house. But despite that, he is a very well-financed politician, and that is one thing he does do well in 1987. He's from the jump is very well-financed. There's a point at which he's second only to Dukakis as far as money. So he has that figured out. But before he runs, 1986 is an important year for this candidacy. He comes out swinging against, quote unquote, the interest groups yet again. These are the enemies of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Committee. Jesse Jackson calls them Democrats for the leisure class. Joe Biden is kind of their guy. They've had to settle for Gary Hart in 1984, who's a little more idiosyncratic. As we said, he's a policy wonk and he wants control and over managing the policy end of things and the DLC. And he is moderate on a lot of stuff, but the DLC, he never officially joins. Hart doesn't join the DLC. But Biden, they love. And Pat Cadell, as we said, he's like this centrist pollster. He has worked for Hart in 1984, goes on to work for New Coke, which doesn't pan out so well. But they want Biden to run.
Democrat of sodas.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the Atari Democrats is a term used about these guys, Hart and Biden. Neoliberal, which people say now, oh, that doesn't mean anything. No one calls themselves a neoliberal. Well, go back to the 80s, and that's what they were saying about Joe Biden and Gary Hart. He gives a speech to the AFL-CIO in 1986, Joe Biden does, and tells an audience of union members, you're not entitled to any more, and you're lucky if you get that much. And he whines to them about the quote-unquote special interests and says Democrats need a broader tent. In other words, they need more upwardly mobile white professionals who that's who the DLC is after, and that's who the Democratic Party winds up gearing their message towards during this time. But Biden is kind of poo-pooing the AFL-CIO. And if you look at his record, that formation, the AFL-CIO, gives him a similar grade as Gary Hart. So he's supposedly this friend of unions, and unfortunately, he was the most pro-union president of my lifetime. But that tells you how low the bar is, because he really was not a friend of labor as a senator for the most part. Again, the bar is low to be a senator and a friend of labor in the first place. But this mythos that he's like Union Joe, that was kind of crafted, and that was something he adopted more as president than in his career. I mean, he had good relations with union officials, but his mantra in Delaware was, I remember from the Joe Biden the American Experience about him, there was a friend of his who was a political ally who said, I never trust a politician when they say they're going to create jobs, because they're always lying when they say that. And that's
giveaways to businesses.
Right. Well, but that's kind of the attitude that that people from Joe Biden's generation have, is that like the government can't create jobs. That's an antiquated idea. So anyone who tells you that is a liar, and he's going to shoot straight and not going to overpromise. Basically, is what Biden's pledge is as a politician coming up in Delaware. So
yeah, and I'm realizing, so he didn't have he has this good middle class accent in like the 2000s. He doesn't really have it down yet in the 80s. He kind of sounds like more of a yuppie. You know, I mean, he grew. I don't know how rich he grew up. He grew up like, you know, his dad had a good job, but not. I don't think he was like super rich.
Well, he's a salesman.
Okay, yeah, his dad's a salesman. His dad's white collar. He goes to law school.
He's like a blue collar salesman kind of, and his dad does get laid off at least once, if not more than that.
And that is great for your political career. Yeah. Your dad getting laid off is amazing. But he goes to law school. He's a lawyer at a law firm. He's in government. He never really worked blue collar, and I think he doesn't have quite as good of a blue collar voice early on.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, because he's part of a new generation of Democrats that, again, are more skeptical of unions. And the DLC, that's their kind of their home, but they are not hegemonic yet in the Democratic Party in the 80s. And this is a really interesting piece of this that has been kind of ignored by history. In 1986, it's the midterms. The DLC is saying we have to run centrists. We have to run economic conservatives. People are going to champion some of Reagan's budget policies, going to be pro-economic growth, pro-business. Well, the Democratic Party at that point hasn't totally drank that Kool-Aid yet, so they run a lot of candidates who are populists. They are for progressive economics, and they're running in the South as progressives who are trying to appeal to a cross-racial coalition. And in 1986, they win that way. That's how they win the midterms. They keep the House, and they take kind of
the Senate, right?
I have to check on that, but
because Biden then becomes like the head of the committee, the head of the Judiciary Committee. And I did also want to add, a lot of the reason they win in '86, we talked about in the Jesse Jackson episode, is the voters Jesse Jackson brought in, and Jesse Jackson is obviously diametrically opposed to the DLC, as you've already said.
Right. Yeah. From his 1984 campaign, where he's registering a lot of new voters. But he also gives a speech to the Rainbow Coalition in 1986. Biden does. And he says, you can't try to pit the Rainbow Coalition, blacks, Hispanics, poor whites, gays, against the middle class, which apparently does not include gays, Hispanics, blacks.
Oh, yeah.
It's just this, very much it's interesting he lumps poor whites in with the Rainbow Coalition. But he's a middle class reductionist, as it were. He poo-poos sort of class war politics, but he's like, you can't talk about the rich and the poor. What about the middle class? He won't shut up about that in the 80s, and for most of his career, really. He talks about how he's always been a middle class guy. He says, I wore a sport coat. I wasn't wearing a flak jacket and a tie-dye shirt. I'm a middle class Joe. He that's what he calls himself, middle class Joe, which I remember when he was vice president. He's like, my colleagues tease me. They call me middle class Joe. I don't think anyone has actually called him that. That's like 100% a lie. That's just a more myth making that
It's
he
like if
comes
I
up with.
called you average height Anders. Like it's not an interesting thing about you that you're in the middle. Yeah. So you're basically saying he's the suburbs. He's not working class people. He's white people in the suburbs, but white working class is not part of that either. Is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. By the way, and I did confirm. Yeah, the Democrats took the Senate back in 1986, and then Joe Biden is going to become head of the Judiciary Committee,
Right.
and that's going to be important later.
Yes. Another thing Biden says to the Rainbow Coalition, he says, you have to reject the voices in the movement who tell Black Americans to go it alone and that only Blacks should represent Blacks. Very confrontational speech to give. But he's, setting himself up for 1987 when he launches. I know did you watch the announcement speech?
I watched a little of it. Yeah, it's in Delaware. It's outside. I saw a little clip of it. He says a couple nice lines. I'll have to find the lines. I do want to say his dream of white people representing Black people is realized in 2020 when he beats two very strong Black candidates, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, with what he's done. So he does achieve that dream. It takes him a very long time to do that.
After being picked up and dusted off by one and becoming vice president.
See, in the speech, he says the mere. So he's saying Americans got to rise above the mere accumulation of material things, because that's what Reagan is pushing, the material world, the Madonna song, whatever. And that is good, though. Joe Biden, as we've said, is very materialistic. Even in his first law office, he's an expensive desk and a couch. You can barely get into the door. His furniture is so big and expensive. So he's not great at not being materialistic. But yeah, he's saying he stopped being like Ronald Reagan. Stop saying, I got mine. Why don't you get yours? What's in it for me? We need to rekindle idealism. And I guess his idealism is centrism because, but he's saying idealism. I think he wants to be kind of, like a Cory Booker guy, like speak radical, actually also like Obama, speak sounding kind of radical and like galvanizing, but push centrist policies. And he is very good at when he needs to, he can sound woke or not racist, whatever, and anti-racist, but he usually is voting for racist policies.
Yes. But in this campaign, he has kind of a middle stance between free trade and protectionism. He's against the Strategic Defense Initiative, and he does support anti-poverty initiatives, child welfare, and he also the war on drugs, which he has a big role in not just 1994, but the 1986 crime bill. But he's also a government reformer. He talks a lot about anti-corruption throughout his career, especially when he's a candidate in 1972. But yeah, what other policies? What's kind of his policy vision in 1988?
He does say he definitely does not want to cut taxes. So he doesn't want to reverse the Reagan tax cut. He does want to cut down the Reagan defense spending, and he'll mention like the system. So and he'll use the word system a lot, and specifically, like SDI, cutting that. He says that it's not going to protect us from a nuclear war. It actually, for some reason, makes it harder to respond to a first strike or something. It's a little gobbled, but he definitely wants to cut that and then get towards balancing the budget. He has an issue where he doesn't stand for anything. It is a little bit like Ted Kennedy. He never has that gaffe. Ted Kennedy's famous gaffe was they asked him in an interview, why do you want to be president? He was like, and then eventually he said, we have good natural resources or whatever. Anders has quoted it a couple times on the pod. It's one of our favorite moments. But so he doesn't have that. At some point, he's like, I'm going to be education. He doesn't really have a thing. And luckily for him, the thing that is going to be his candidacy is there's going to be a Supreme Court fight over this guy named Robert Bork, who is he's Clarence Thomas or Alito. So the Bork is going to do everything they're currently doing now, but in 1988. And Biden is like, we Democrats will vote for people. I think they even had voted for Scalia because Scalia towed the line in some way. But Bork is just a bridge too far. He's too obvious that he wants to get rid of Roe v. Wade and some other things. And they're going to galvanize around Bork. And that's me. Joe Biden is saving the Constitution and saving abortion. And that is going to kind of galvanize his campaign.
Right. And his economic policy is also interesting, too, and kind of presages a new era for Democrats where he is for childcare, universal childcare. He wants them in offices He says the workplaces should have daycare centers, but it shouldn't be done by government mandate. The way you do this is take the White House. You start a daycare center at the White House because, in his words, if other chief executives see a president doing it, they will likely follow suit. The word likely there is doing a ton of work, just assuming that the nation's bosses will just line up behind spending an astronomical amount of money on childcare for their employees. But it is in line.
Insanely expensive. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
crazy. You're going to destroy their profits. Also, there's all kinds of liabilities with owning a daycare center. So
Right.
yeah, like if you hire the wrong person, or like my kid gets your kid sick, and then you're mad, and then it affects us at work. It's a nightmare.
Right. The only two ways you do that, or you fund it with the government, you use taxpayer dollars to fund universal daycares or create some kind of system like we have in New York City, or you force the employers to do it by the threat of force. Like that's the only way that's going to happen. You're not going to suggest universal daycare and then just kind of cajole. Like he would have been roundly mocked if he had actually tried to do that. I mean, it would have been nice, I guess, to have a daycare at the White House, but it is kind of in line with a Biden thing where he's very big on family and he gets mad at his employees who work for him in his Senate office if they take too much time away from their families. So if they're working for him on a holiday, he loses it and he like yells at them. He's like, "Go home and be with your kids." To me, that's kind of where the daycare policy comes from. But this is obviously, very much a gimmick and not like a serious plan to help families with daycare. And a lot of these other ideas are he wants to balance the budget by 1993, but without raising taxes, which Clinton is able to do, able to budget it, balance the budget a few years later after that when he becomes president. But he does, to his somewhat credit, he does raise taxes on the rich to do that. But Biden is promising to just make everybody happy, make a deal, make a Trump-style deal that makes everybody happy and won't raise taxes, but without telling you where the money's going to come from.
It is. The White House daycare is also a terrible idea. I want to get back to that for a second because there's going to be all the press is there. There's going to be all kinds of scandals. They're going to be like, this staffer's kid pooped 3 times today. What is she feeding him? There's going to, or the toys. This kid won't share, just like they don't share. And then the department, the diplomats will drop their kids. There'll be international incidents. White House daycare is like, that could be a show. A comedy show. It is like even like a plot line on that show. That's My Bush, which is a comedic show by George W. Bush before 9/11. It's like a thing that he would do on that.
Imagine if, he would have been president at the end of the Cold War if he had gotten elected. You have Gorbachev finally coming to the United States. What if he brings his grandkids and the Biden grandkids are there in the same daycare center and somebody bites somebody's ear, like what's going to happen if there's scrapping between the grandchildren of the respective world leaders? That could totally destroy the possibilities for the time. Maybe the Cold War doesn't actually end if this daycare center thing happens.
And Yeltsin's kids are already alcoholics too. And that's gonna be a problem.
They bring little bottles of vodka into the White House daycare center. There's another thing too, and this is another policy that is so indicative of Biden's whole thing and Democrats of this era. He wants to pass a law that when a company lays off its workers and they close the plant, they give them 90 days notice, which is like, I guess that's better than not knowing 90 days in advance. But what I think people are really looking for is somebody who's going to be able to stop the plants from closing, which I'm sure he was promising, but knows he can't deliver on. So it's, again, gimmicks like this.
Yeah, it's the small. It's really the smallest things. I mean, how long do you usually get? You usually might get a few days, so you're getting an extra month or two. I mean, I might just make them pay them for a few more days. I think some other. I believe I've heard of this issue again another time, but I can't place it right now. Yeah, he is very small on the policies. It's a lot about him. He also he kind of lives by the secret, Joe Biden, where if he wills it, he can picture it, it will happen. Actually, the secret may have stolen from him. I wonder if they read Richard Ben Kramer's book and then invented it in like the later 90s.
Yeah, I mean, he does have, poverty, to be fair, is something that comes up, particularly kids, because once you're an adult, you're fucked. It's all your fault if you're poor. But if you're a kid, in his vision, I guess you deserve some freedom from hunger and free healthcare, which maybe that's like what became the CHIPS program, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, we got CHIP. Believe they still have it. I hope Trump isn't trying to take it in the budget. I mean, from what I've heard back when I was more lib, I think it is a good thing, CHIP. I don't know how extensive it is. I mean, I'm sure it's better than not having it. Maybe something else would be even better, though.
Yeah. And he does want to add $1 to the minimum wage over 4 years, which, again, better than nothing. And that is another thing that happens under Clinton. The minimum wage does go up a couple bucks, although who knows? Bush, too, also raised the minimum wage. So, and then the welfare. His welfare policy is very similar to what Clinton does, making most anyone on welfare get jobs or join job training and educational programs. So this was an idea that was kicking around and was promoted by the Joe Bidens of the world before it becomes law in 1996.
Yeah, Clinton is just a more charismatic, sexier, more hair version of Biden. Biden is trying to appeal to the South, but Delaware, really isn't the South. It's mid-Atlantic, whatever,
Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing that makes them the South is that they did at one point have slavery, but he's not going to bring that up.
Well, he does. He loves bringing that up. He brought it up in 2008 or 2007 when he's running for president, and he's asked on Fox News by Chris Wallace, "Aren't you a Northeastern liberal? How are you going to win a national election?" And he's like, Delaware's not a Northeastern state. My state used to be a slave state, he says, like it's something he's proud of. But he does like to bring that up. And it's, again, a kind of an insecurity thing. And I remember watching video of him campaigning in 2007, and he just out of nowhere just starts talking about how, to people in New Hampshire, he starts telling them how Delaware is kind of a southern state, which is somewhat true. I mean, I have been there a number of times, as I said on Well, There's Your Problem. And if you live in the D.C. area, as I did as a little kid, if you're rich, you go to Maine. If you're middle-class Joe, you go to Delaware. And then if you're poor in the summer, you just find a meat freezer. But Delaware, if you go there, there are Confederate flags here and there. And I guess there are southern, it's not too far from Virginia. And then Maryland, which also has a weird thing where it's like, is it East Coast or South? But this is...
I don't even consider Northern Virginia to be the South. Northern Virginia, they still seem very northern to me. The problem with the Confederate flag is it's just wherever you're outside a city and there's racist, because you see them in Canada, you see them in New York State. So like they're everywhere, Confederate flags. You definitely didn't need to secede. And yeah, Delaware did stay in the Union. It was a border state.
Right. They stayed in the Union. And because their slave owners were not really affiliated with the cotton economy, is how I think I had explained to me.
It's actually the last state to have slavery. The Confederate states when the war's over, they had to get rid of slavery. Delaware waited all the way until the amendment took place. Yeah. So yeah, Joe Biden passed Juneteenth as a federal holiday, but his state had slaves for like 6 more months after Juneteenth. I always thought that was kind of ironic. That really is the Joe Biden contradiction.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Well, that makes sense, because they were like, we're not going to secede. We'll be in the Union. We can have slaves, right? It seemed like kind of the deal they cut out.
They had slaves the whole war. Yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense. But this is relevant to this because Biden in 88 is trying to position himself as the candidate of the South. He's very much trying to go for, and again, presaging Bill Clinton. That's what he does 4 years later.
He has a little tricky thing. This doesn't end up coming up as Biden drops out, but Al Gore Biden's trying to be young too. He's 44. He's trying to position himself as kind of like a boomer, even though he's a silent generation. But Al Gore is 6 years younger, and Al Gore is legit Southern. He's from Tennessee.
Right.
Which did secede, but got reconquered really quickly.
Yeah. But he gives a speech in North Carolina. He calls North Carolina the conscience of the South. I don't know what that means, why it's the most moral Southern state, apparently.
It might be my favorite Southern state, but I don't know that they were any more moral when it came to slavery.
Yeah, probably not. And he even there's one event where I guess this is with Al Gore, but he's the only speaker at the event who is not a Southerner, and he's still really hitting this Southern theme. And they're all like, "Isn't he from Delaware? Like, what's going on?" But again, it's the weird insecurities he has. He does also talk about his friend Chuck Robb in Virginia, and says that the Democratic Party would be much better off if Chuck Robb were the chairman, or who was the chairman of the DLC at the time, if he ran for president. And Chuck Robb, for people who don't know, was a governor and then a senator from Virginia. One of my favorite movies, A Perfect Candidate, is about his Senate campaign in 1994 against Oliver North, who he was the North was a Republican nominee for Senate against this guy who just is like a cartoon of how just phony, slimy Democratic politicians, especially of this era, are. Like, he's Bill Clinton, and a lot of these guys. Joe Biden is somewhat of an example, although he has, a little bit of his own charm. But there are a ton of these guys who are doing the Clinton policies, but without the Clinton charm, and it just falls flat. Spoiler alert, he does get reelected, but that's because he's running against Oliver North. This is the kind of guy Joe Biden is cozying up to, just this ultra phony guy. He talks like this. He has what I would call the Northern Virginia accent, which before I saw this movie, I didn't even know was a thing. And it's kind of how I talk, like a newscaster, sort of. But
that's crazy. And we're talking more about all I know. If we finally do Bob Dole, because Bob Dole was involved a lot in that and helping get Reagan at Iran-Contra. Biden is asked early in the campaign, and he thinks that Bob Dole is going to be the nominee. I think he thinks Iran-Contra is going to sink George Bush.
Interesting.
But nothing can sink George Bush except for Bill Clinton.
Yeah. But yeah, he loves Chuck Robb. And then Alabama, the Senator Howell Heflin, which is a guy's real name, is praising Biden for being a fiscal conservative and being sympathetic to the South's quote-unquote traditions and values, which I'm not sure what he means by that. But Biden says to the audience where these two guys are speaking, he says, quote, "A black man has a better chance in Birmingham than in Philadelphia or New York."
Statistically, probably not, right?
I don't know. It's just kind of a weird point to make as a politician. But the size of the population might play a role in that. I don't know, but
that could be. The social programs and stuff like minimum wages and stuff. There's a lot of issues, for workers and low income people and education wise in Alabama. But
right.
It'd be interesting to see. He kind of, I'm sure he means it in a certain way.
Yes, and especially given that around this time in the campaign, he's lying and talking about how he was active in the civil rights movement, which later he has to recant. And he's also talking a lot about Bull Connor, who used dogs against protesters. And during this speech, he just so happens to not bring up either of those things, which he, around this time, again, has been saying like every chance he can get. But he gets
Also, we've been going against Bull Connor, and then now he's not, but he's not going to talk about it in the South.
right, or not in front of this crowd, yeah. And then he gets a commendation from a conservative columnist, Dick Williams, who says like this guy is the best and the brightest among this generation of politicians. And Biden takes a compliment from this guy who has also bragged about busting a union at the TV station he works at. So this is kind of the company he's keeping in 1987 when he's kicking off his run for president.
Yeah, and his whole campaign is in 87. He's only in the race for 3 months. Yeah, so a lot of it is just getting ready to run. We'll talk about why. And he's trying to market himself, like I said, the guy of the boomers. Like, we're going to bring back 1968, and we're going to do it right this time. Back when you were young, because the boomers are going to be the majority of the electorate. And in this case, the boomers are people who are in their 30s, 40s, maybe even 20s. So they're kind of like the people who are the age me and Anders are now. And so it's going to be the candidate of the boomers. But in 1968, Joe Biden wasn't some hippie who loved RFK. He was already an adult with kids, and he's wearing a suit. He's like a lawyer or whatever. So he's not a hippie, he's not in their generation, and he has to kind of try to fake it. He is not. The lies are going to catch up to him.
Right. But an interesting dynamic about this race is that it's rumored that Ted Kennedy, or Mario Cuomo, kind of an old school liberal, although I don't know. I've been doing some reading on Mario Cuomo, and definitely overrated as a liberal, a welfare liberal. He was not very kind to people on the lower rungs of society, but he was at least from that tradition and was from a eastern coastal state. And the Democratic Party was different at that point, so that was kind of the coalition that someone like a Cuomo or a Kennedy was going to try to cohere. And then on the other side, you have people like Joe Biden, who are going for the yuppies and neoliberals on economic policies. So that was the fight that was shaping up going into 1987, 1988. And then neither of those guys run. Both Cuomo and Kennedy don't do it. So there's really no formidable left-wing candidate until Jesse Jackson steps in, and he's, has never held elected office, so he's not taken seriously. But the reason that he does as well as he does in 88 has a lot to do with the vacuum. But because there's that vacuum, that should give Biden a better chance, because he doesn't have to compete with a liberal. He just kind of has to outflank the rest of the conservative Democrats. But then that, doesn't bode well for Democratic voters who are just kind of like, in a lot of cases, disillusioned. But as far as
it is going to be, and Dukakis is very much centered. Yeah, it's a weak field. So Joe Biden obviously now is very, very well known. But back then he wasn't that well known, unless you were in Delaware or I think if you were like a politics nerd, but he was not super well known. So the field is Snow White, which is Gary Hart, and the Seven Dwarfs. So he's just lumped in with the Seven Dwarfs. I'm not sure which one is. Maybe Sleepy. I know Trump maybe calls him that later. So so it is a weak field, and it does seem like that because George H.W. Bush was beatable. Parties rarely win the presidency 3 times in a row. There'd been scandals. People are not doing amazingly in the economy and everything. And it is just a very weak field. And Biden thinks he can take it, but then he has his issues.
Yes. He but he also goes after Jesse Jackson. He's said to be the only candidate with the guts to say what everyone else is thinking. Jackson takes a shot at Biden. He gives a speech in Wilmington where he criticizes Democratic centrists who are riding with the Kennedy credentials on the coattails of Reaganite reaction. And he talks about, quote unquote, deficit cutters who are, quote, combing their hair to the left like Kennedy and moving their policies to the right like Reagan. Feels like a shot at Joe Biden's hairline at the time.
It's devastating. Now that I know about the Biden coma, I've read that quote before. It is devastating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Biden was saying what everyone's thinking, meaning that a black guy isn't a legitimate candidate, which is how Jesse was treated basically the whole time.
Right. Yeah. He wasn't taken seriously until the last moment, where he's beating out people like Biden, who's not even in the race anymore, and Jackson is winning states like Michigan. But this is all part of a strategy from Pat Cadell. That he has a memo that he passes around to all these millionaire fundraisers who are like, we have to push the Democrats even further to the right. And the ideal nominee from Pat Cadell is an inside insurgent who could personify generational change, according to Marchitich, without threatening the establishment, and hold conservative positions on issues like crime, abortion, the deficit in the military. And baby boomers at this time are 58% of the electorate and are fairly non-ideological, nonpartisan, and anti-establishment. So someone like Biden, who is seen as an outsider for whatever reason, just because he's not like a national figure, and is appealing to a little bit more of a conservative sensibility. So Biden is, again, really that candidate, but
it is weird to be 15 years in the Senate and be an outsider.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the voice down yet, but yeah, Joe Biden just being a white dude who can kind of sound like he cares about stuff, he can take you pretty far.
Right. But he kind of digs his own grave. As we've been alluding to, there's a series of scandals. The one that is probably remember the most is the one that has, because it has a video accompanying it from Neil Kinnick of the time, who is giving this wonderful speech, who at some point we should do a Neil Kinnick episode. He'll be our first international member of the Vanquished. He's an interesting character. He was interviewed about this actually last summer because he was campaigning against Jeremy Corbyn, who had to run as an independent in the UK. And Kinnick is a former labor leader who was a democratic socialist and still is, technically. He identifies as such, but he was a really wishy-washy figure as labor leader and is now just totally sold out to the right wing of the Labor Party, and was campaigning against Corbyn. A very similar figure to Biden in several ways, including their backgrounds. Kinnick gives this speech where he's like, why am I the first Kinnick in 1,000 generations who went to college or university? And he gives a little story about how his ancestors used to work in the mines all day, and then they'd come up and play football. And Joe Biden is having trouble connecting. He's having trouble identifying a theme for his campaign. And so he's watching videos to try and get inspired. And he comes across this video of Neil Kinnick. And he's like, whoa, football, we call what we play here football. That's crazy that his ancestors worked in mines and then played football, when that's actually what mine did too, because we're saying the same word even though they're different sports. Isn't that, he's like, his mind is being blown. He's never done acid, but this is the closest thing, is watching
It's
this.
we speak English and they speak English also. You know what I mean? Like, how can they speak our language?
Right. He's like freaking out. He needs some oranges. He needs to come down. And this actually probably is induced by some chemicals. Maybe he's visited his house. He's spent some time at the Wilmington Manor, and I can't imagine he's an expert at removing asbestos. Probably some was left in some crevasses and that gets in his system. Then he watches this video and forgets who he is because he goes out on the stump and he does, for the most part, cite Neil Kinnick, except when he gets carried away. And then he just says straight up, why am I the first Biden in 1,000 generations of Bidens? Which I don't know if there's 1,000 generations of Biden, but that, why am I the first to go to college? Why is the same true of my wife? Why, he gives Kinnick's speech. And I think this is at a debate, right?
Yeah, he closes with it at one of the debates. Yes, yeah, it's very hard to keep it true. He plagiarized a lot of people. But this is his debate closing, and in debate closing, you wouldn't have time to cite anybody. 1,000 generations is crazy too. I want to say I think that's 20,000 years. That is a long time.
Yeah.
I don't think there was farming back then. Yeah, I don't know. They didn't have last names are pretty new. Yeah, as a ancient history nerd, I'm disgusted. Your hunter-gatherer ancestors were not named Biden, and they weren't in mines or whatever. They just had like little stone axes or whatever. I'm trying to get the end of the
right. He might as well. You might as well talk about his Cro-Magnon ancestors bopping each other on the head with stones. Like, they weren't thinking about the New Deal or the UK Labour Party.
But I'm trying to get back to the Kinnick. Yeah, so he plagiarizes that line from Kinnick at the end of a debate in like August or something, and that's maybe that kind of kickstarts things on the plagiarism scandal because he'll be out by September. But he has earlier plagiarized. He plagiarized like RFK in like not his very first speech in Delaware, but like he makes kind of like like I'm here kind of speech in California, and he plagiarizes RFK, and that's way too famous a person to get away with.
And what's the RFK line that he takes?
Trying to pull it up here. Okay, good. AC. Okay, black. Yeah.
Is this but this standard cannot measure the happiness of our...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so his big argument against Reagan is actually plagiarized from RFK, which is interesting because Reagan and RFK's careers barely overlapped. Yeah, you want to read it?
Yeah, he says, but this standard cannot measure the happiness of our children. He's talking about the bottom line. The quality of their education or the promise of their future. It cannot measure the intelligence of our public debate or the integrity of our public officials. It counts neither our wit nor our wisdom, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. So it's kind of similar to his opening speech for the campaign, where he's saying that life's about more than material things. It's about more than statistics. But has he correctly cited RFK at any point, or he
doesn't cite RFK in this speech, and then they're trying to add a citation. His campaign manager, and Kramer talks about it, is trying to add a citation in the transcript after he didn't do it in the speech.
Oh, yeah.
I think even if I guess you could cite RFK. He's really trying to be a knockoff Kennedy. He's trying to get a knockoff Kennedy compound. We talked about that. And now he has lines that sound like JFK, and then he's actually stealing from RFK. So he's very much obsessed with it. And being a Kennedy is good because you can be seen as left-leaning, but you get to be rich. And Joe Biden definitely wants to be rich.
Right. He wants to be, but he's not. Yeah, he's not from that ilk. So he has the plagiarism scandal with Kinnick, the plagiarism scandal with Bobby Kennedy, and then it turns out he had an even previous plagiarism scandal when he was at law school. What happened there?
In Syracuse, he was at Syracuse, and he just was being lazy, and he just like stole an entire someone named Joe. He's Joe. Sorry, Artie Cooper. Joe just steals, like, plagiarizes an entire paper, and he's like planning to cite it, but he doesn't, and then he gets caught, and he's just like really upset. And it's like, well, maybe we'll kick him out of the school, but he's really good at just seeming contrite. And he says, please don't label me a cheater. And they say, okay, you can retake the course. And then he gets a B. Because when Kramer's point is kind of like, he does do this kind of stuff, but if he's able to get himself to focus, he's a pretty good student. And he can actually be a pretty good lawyer, and he does a good job in the Bork hearings with the research.
Yes, eventually, yeah. But he also has to walk back the stuff we said earlier about the civil rights activism. He has talked about a time where he and a group of his classmates went to a restaurant with the one black student in their class, and then they supposedly left when that student was banned from eating at the restaurant. But the Philadelphia Inquirer did some digging. They found that classmate who was a doctor in Philadelphia, who maybe Denzel Washington's character was based on him in the movie Philadelphia, come to think of it. But he recalls that Biden and the group, they didn't leave the restaurant in solidarity. In fact, they didn't even notice that this guy had been kicked out until they had finished
Ooh.
eating. So they leave they don't notice it. They finish their meal and then they leave, and they're like, "Oh, where were you? What happened?" Who knows? Maybe they would have done that themselves independently if they didn't know that, but we'll never know because that's not
Did they
what
pay
happened.
the check? Because if you leave after eating but you dine and dash, maybe that's like for the cause. But if you pay your
Yeah.
check and you're just done, like everyone eventually leaves every restaurant. You got to leave before they close. You can't stay
Right.
forever.
I assume they paid the check. He has middle class values, so I don't think he would dine and dash, even from a segregationist. And then he's challenged by reporters, and this is when the other scandals about the plagiarism are brewing. He's challenged by reporters, and he admits, he breaks down and does kind of a Biden confessional, very Catholic sort of. He just gives it all up, and is totally honest, kind of the way he was with Richard Ben Kramer without being asked to. And he says that his activism in the civil rights movement was nothing of any consequence, and that once he joined a picket of a segregated movie theater after working one summer at an all-black swimming pool. And that experience, which is now infamous because of the corn pop story, that is what he says opened his eyes about racism, supposedly, which maybe is true. But he admits, I was never an activist. The civil rights movement was an awakening for me, not as a consequence of my participation, but as a consequence of my being made aware of what was happening. And he does later say, like, hey, some people went on marches and stuff. I ran for office. Like, that was what his way of contributing. In addition to being a lifeguard, he then became the lifeguard of the county he lived in as a county councilman, I guess.
Yeah, he was probably less racist than the other people in his suburbs and stuff like that. The one thing is, he knew he was going to be in the Democratic Party, it sounds like, and the Democratic Party was the party of civil rights, very much affirmed after Johnson in '64. So I think he knows he's going to need to be pro civil rights. But yeah, it does not a huge amount of because even like Joe Lieberman, I think, marched in something. So there are examples of centrists who did some little somethings here and there.
Mitch McConnell, if I'm not mistaken, was at the March on Washington or was some kind of civil rights guy.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
He's the weirdest one. Yeah. At some point during the Bork hearings, Biden bests Mitch McConnell in some kind of like battle of wits because Biden's really prepared that day. There is a good embarrassing thing. He's in New Hampshire, campaigning ahead of the primary that he's not going to end up being in. But and a resident questions him about his law school grades, and Biden says, "I think I probably have a much higher IQ than you do. I suspect." And then he says like that he graduated in the top half of his law class, which wasn't true, and all that. But yeah, he's getting into that Biden, feistiness that no one really likes to see.
Right. That's another scandal. He lies about being in the top of his class. He's questioned about that. And he says he graduated with 3 degrees and was the outstanding student in the political science department, which the outstanding student, I don't know if that's an official award or just a thing he said about himself. And that he went to law school on a scholarship, and he's just yelling at this guy. It looks like he's on cocaine. He's just so mad when he says, I'd be delighted to sit back and compare IQs. All of this stuff comes out as false, which he explains as, I exaggerate when I'm angry. which I'm surprised he did. I mean, maybe the full end of that quote is him trying to attribute it to him being Irish or something too. But
Yeah, he should have said, I'm always angry. Yeah, he finished. I don't know how good of a law school Syracuse was back then, but he finishes 76 out of 85, which is pretty bad.
yeah,
I think it's just a middle of the road law school. I would assume it's not a great law school now. I mean, it wasn't in the Ivy League or anything like that.
right. But then September 1987 rolls around, and a couple things culminate. The Bork hearings, which you said he does study for, and he is,
And that's his thing.
yeah.
To go ahead the
Go
Bork
ahead.
hearings. So his argument for being president is I'm going to defeat Bork and galvanize everybody. And there's a big organization behind defeating Bork that he sees as his base, like his version of the Rainbow Push Coalition, almost, if you will. So he needs to both defeat Bork and then to win the primary. So if this cheating scandal will make it where he can't defeat Bork, he doesn't want to sabotage that for the good of the country, but also that will make it impossible for him to win as well. And that's going to all kind of come into it as a factor.
Right. But he ends up during the Bork hearings, he moves over to a room in the Senate building and says that he is calling it quits, and he has to kind of put his tail between his legs and drop out of the presidential race, even though his sons are like, you gotta stick with it, Dad. Don't do it. Don't drop out. He's like, nope, I gotta do it. Sorry.
And even
yeah.
Oh, and even Bo is like, you'll be like Gary Hart,
Right.
who already dropped out. Now it's actually the opposite, but yeah, Gary Hart, his political career, I think, is over at this point, and then Biden drops out. I think they're reasonably similar ages, but obviously Biden's going to run for president 3 more times after this.
Yeah. Yeah. Gary Hart, I don't know what. I think he stays in the. I think Gary Hart retires not that long after the '88 race, and then Biden.
Yeah, Gary Hart is 6 years older than him. I'm not sure when he. Yeah, I'll have to see when he left. When he leaves the Congress, but it's not. I don't think he's there for too long.
Yeah, and Biden sticks around, and he's still around by 2008, of course.
Gary Hart leaves the Senate in 1987, I think, to run for president. Obama makes him a diplomat. He does get to be the special envoy to Northern Ireland. So that's maybe an important job.
Yeah. As far as diplomats go, that's up there. But the campaign ends, and then Biden does have to get hospitalized because he has a brain aneurysm at the base of his brain, and then a second aneurysm, and then has to take 7 months to recover from 2 very high-risk cranial surgeries and a blood clot operation in his lung. And there's one point during this hospital stay where a priest reads him his last rites. So he could have died. It came pretty close there. But
it's a crazy comeback. It's very Jesus-like. Yeah, he almost dies, and then he comes back and he becomes king. Yeah, that's amazing.
Right.
I mean, it takes him a long time, but that's incredible. It is weird. A lot of presidents, like George Bush, almost dies in the war. A lot of these people. This book is about all of them have like insane trauma before they run for president.
Right.
But there is. I'll have to think about it. The other presidents who almost died. I know Bob Dole almost died, but he certainly doesn't win.
Yeah. But yeah, he goes on to kind of fail upwards, though. There's the Anita Hill hearings, which is after he comes back from the hospital. And then he does the crime bill of 1994. And then by 2008, he's ready to run for president again, even though maybe 2004 would have been his year, or somewhere along the line, but not 2008. Wasn't in the cards.
It was a weak field, and maybe it could be Kerry. Yeah, Kerry wasn't that strong. You got a little feistiness in you.
Yeah, he could have done Kerry, but instead, I guess ultimately he does make the best decision, and that's to run in 2008 and embarrass himself again, and then get picked up and dusted off. At some point, maybe we'll do a bonus on the 2008 race. But as we're rounding out here, it's not inconceivable that he wins. I guess he would have to kind of go back in time and not tell all those lies, or at least just keep chugging like Trump proved you can
That's
do.
the issue, is that if he wasn't like stealing the speeches in this campaign, he doesn't necessarily get caught. And I think he could have been the nominee. But then, and you're like, well, anyone would have beaten Bush, but Bush was good at like beating people. So Bush would have probably then brought these things out, and he would have done similar stuff to what he did to Dukakis. I'm not sure, but yeah. So Bush, because Bush was ready, you know, they had like the all-time all-stars of attacking. So I think Bush might have found a way to beat him in with the attacking, not to get ahead of ourselves on the counterfactuals.
Right. Well, I mean, it's because he and Dukakis kind of have the opposite problems, whereas Dukakis didn't want to hit back. He was too reserved, too timid. And Biden, I could definitely imagine him hitting back, but he's a blowhard, so he could have said something stupid. He could have tried to defend himself and made the problem worse, and maybe gotten too negative on George H.W. Bush, because the only general election he was in as the presidential nominee, really to the end, was against Trump, and you could go all out against Trump. There's no risk of going too negative against Trump. So if he does that against George H.W. Bush, maybe that would have come back to bite him. But that was a very negative campaign, 1988. That kind of set the tone for the next, the era we're still living in. I think he may have stood a better chance than Dukakis, potentially.
We know Dukakis was bad, and he ends up losing 400 the other guy gets 400 electoral votes in an election that seemed close, and he was leading in. So, like, that's an all-time tank. So yeah, you always would assume someone would be better than Dukakis. He might be one of the worst campaigns ever run, based on the Edinger Mentum rankings. He's certainly up there. It's just pathetic campaign. I do have a couple things on it. We're gonna do what he was like as president.
Yeah,
he would be like his president. Yeah, I mean, if he's president in '88, I mean, the Cold War seemed like it was going. He probably would have been able to figure that one out. But he would have been bad with Israel, Palestine. The first Intifada is going on, and George H.W. Bush is actually a little hard on Israel and works towards the peace process. And I think maybe Biden would have been cracking more down on the first Intifada. He might have been bad with that. So that is one thing that scares me. Because he would still remember Gold in My Ear and all that stuff.
Right. Yeah, I think he would have done a lot of the Clinton stuff earlier. Welfare reform would have happened. Balanced budget, maybe, but I guess without tax increases, so they just cut a bunch of stuff. Maybe they actually cut defense, because Clinton did do a little bit of that. So maybe that's how they get to the balanced budget, or they don't get a balanced budget.
He would definitely do the Gulf War. Yeah, he's definitely doing the Gulf War for sure.
Well, that is a vote. He actually voted against the Gulf War. He did the worst combination politically, which is he voted against the first one and for the second one, largely because of the lessons he learned from, quote unquote, lessons from voting against the first one. But if he's the president, maybe that happens. He does come from like a bit of a dovish generation that still has, quote unquote, Vietnam syndrome at this point. So maybe the Gulf War doesn't happen, or maybe it happens without the U.S. And honestly, I could see there being a big scandal where he doesn't do the Gulf War, and then conservatives are outraged, some Democrats are outraged, and that is his undoing. I could see that happening. And there's also economic turmoil at home because he's pursuing a lot of the same like Bush, Reagan, Clinton austerity policies.
That's interesting. I see him as a warmonger from his term that he had, but yeah, this is a much younger Joe Biden. So
yeah, but yeah, plus it's also, he definitely would have given Israel a blank check, but that doesn't necessarily mean he'd put boots on the ground in like other places in like Kuwait in the Middle East.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I just think Israel would have had been able to handle the first Intifada more violently, or at least doesn't result in the peace process. I'm not sure. I'd have to game it all out. But I just thought, yeah, always worse on Israel than George H.W. Bush, who's one of the better presidents on Israel we've had, if you're pro-Palestine.
Sadly. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The bar is low. Like, I don't know who the second most pro-union president of my lifetime is, because I was born during Reagan. I don't know if Obama is pro-union, or I don't even know. So yeah, that's the thing. So he's kind of the most pro-union president of my lifetime because there wasn't one already. So it was like a vacated seat, and then he just took it over. Though it's nice that the good things that happen are nice, because yeah, there was some advancements in that.
Perhaps we will do a 2008 at some point, and I will definitely, even though he was president, there's a lot of losing in Joe Biden's life, including in presidential campaigns. So in all likelihood, we'll be talking about that book when it comes out and reveals all the goodies about that crazy, crazy time when we were playing Weekend at Bernie's with the president. Until then, thank you all for tuning in. Check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thevanquished. I am at Anders Lee here on social media, and our podcast is at Vanquished Pod.
At Orange Freddy G. Have a good night.
All right, it's Vanquished.